How's it going, class? Glad to see you. We've got a really weird double class that we're going to be doing today. The first topic is going to be the fairly innocuous public relations, and then we're going to move into the slightly more fraught field of sexual content in media. They're both extremely important topics for us to cover, and they can be challenging topics for us to cover. Whenever I bring up sexual content in media, people tend to recoil a little bit, as we're going to talk about. So let's start with the much more wholesome public relations, which has its roots in something much more agreeable: mass murder. Anyway, public relations as a field kind of got started in connection with this question. Why is the 8-hour workday the norm, if it is still the norm? Why do we hope for an 8-hour workday anyway? It all started in this place, in a town called Ludlow. Ludlow was one of these mining towns that was run by the Rockefeller Corporation. Basically, back in the early 20th century, late 19th century, there were areas of the country where there were towns or cities or villages that were effectively owned by corporations. Now, the corporations would lure workers into these locations by promising them some great things, right? They would give them housing that would be better than the housing that they would have available to them in like cities and so forth. They would offer them health care and education for their children. So they'd have a lot of these like kind of perks, but they would also do some things that were really uncool and sometimes even illegal. They would pay their employees, for example, in something called scrip instead of actual money. So once you were on this campus, once you were a miner in this area, you were stuck. If you wanted to leave, you couldn't because you didn't have any money. Beyond that, the corporations would also enforce certain company rules and employ company policemen in order to enforce these rules. So basically, there were groups of armed thugs working on behalf of the company that were, enacting various company rules like curfews and so forth. It got to be a very bad situation and one that was very difficult to escape from because, of course, if you're only paid in scrip, if you're only paid in money that's only good for that one little town, how are you supposed to leave? If you leave, you immediately have nothing. There was effectively a way of indenturing these workers and forcing them to work interminably. Beyond that, some of these places, Ludlow being one of them, really started to resemble kind of prison camps, like with barbed wire fences and everything, winding around the thing. Anyway, what happened in Ludlow is that they started getting a little bit fed up with some of the policies of the company, and so they decided to push back. They started striking, and these weren't like even very dedicated strikes. These were kind of light strikes, I guess you could say. There were some problems with the company's policy. The company paid its workers based on how much coal they would produce, which sounds pretty good. Except that if you're mining coal, then there's certain things that you have to do in order to get the coal out. For example, you have to build safety structures, right? You have to shore up the mine. You have to run safety equipment. And all of these things require manpower. But anything that you were doing that wasn't actively bringing coal out of the ground, you were effectively doing for free. Which means that you were disincentivized from spending time putting safety stuff up because you were doing it for free for no reason. It was pretty grisly. So what ended up happening is they started this strike. And I'm just making sure of a number here. Yes, there we go. They started this strike. And what happens next is a little on the murky side, but what we know is the head of the strike went out to see basically these National Guards type men who had surrounded the city of Ludlow with instructions to break the strike. And they had an argument between the two of them. The one guy got struck, the head of the striking miners got struck on the back of the head with a rifle and then shot in the back and killed. When he was shot, the riflemen that were all lined up aiming down into the town of Ludlow all started opening fire and were blind firing, basically, bullets into these kind of ramshackle type buildings that the Rockefeller Corporation had put them up in. At the end of the day, 55 people had been killed inside the city of Ludlow, or this mining community of Ludlow. The real tragedy of it is that most of the people who were killed were not striking miners. Most of them were women and children. Buildings had caught fire and children had burned to death. It was a horrifying, shocking thing. And there was actually this instance where he was summoned to testify before a Senate subcommittee. And one of his allies in the Senate was trying to lob him a softball so that he could get himself out of trouble. But Rockefeller was like this creepy lizard man who didn't have human emotions and feelings almost. So the senator lobs him the softball and says, okay, well, Mr. Rockefeller, if you had been there on the day that the Ludlow massacre occurred, how would things have gone differently? I mean, it's like the easiest question that you can ask somebody. The correct answer, of course, is, oh, everything would have been fine. Nobody would have died. There would have been no violence. Everyone would have gotten everything that they wanted. But Rockefeller was such a lizard man, he replies, I would have had them shooting sooner, right? He's just like a disgusting person. And it's a huge PR disaster. And everybody's like, Rockefeller's hosed. So the Rockefeller Corporation says, we are going to need to do something because they're going to shut us down. And they called in this guy. This is Ivy Ledbetter Lee. He's one of the originators of what we would call public relations. Now, Ivy looks at Rockefeller and he says, this is not the man that we should have out front dealing with this crisis. People are going to look at him and listen to him, and they're going to know that he's barely human. So let's do better. What about Rockefeller's son? Now, Rockefeller did have a son, and his son was pretty good looking, really shy. He was just as evil as his dad, but he was so shy that you would almost not know that he was that evil. So Ivy Ledbetter Lee goes to the younger Rockefeller and he says, okay, here's what we're going to do to fix your company's reputation and save it for you maybe. What you're going to do is you're going to organize a town hall for the residents of Ludlow. You're going to go there and you're just going to let them yell at you for a little while. And the son says, I don't want to do that. And Ivy says, you're going to do that. And then he says, then what's going to happen is they're going to be yelling at you and they're going to make some demands of you. You're going to choose a few of those demands that you find least objectionable, and you're going to go ahead and do those. You can ignore most of them, but pick a few to agree to. And the Rockefeller says, I don't want to. And Ivy says, you're gonna. And then he says, and then you're going to think of a thing or two that's really painless and small, and you're going to do those, and they didn't ask for them. So it's going to look like you're going above and beyond what the people asked for. So that it looks really good. And then you're going to go walking around. You're going to tour the devastation. And we're going to have a lot of reporters and photographers, and you're going to sit and you're going to look around. You're going to look sad as you look at things. We're going to have people taking pictures of you, and he's going to I don't want to do that. And Ivy says, we're going to do it. And that is exactly what happens. He goes to the town hall. People yell at him for a while, make demands. He accepts a few of those demands. He adds a couple small things that are pretty painless. One of the demands that he agrees to is the 8-hour workday, for example. And he enacts those things, but ignores most of the things that they are asking for and demanding. This is a picture from when Rockefeller was going through and touring this devastated community. Well, at the end of the whole thing, he came out looking great. People are like, wow, that Rockefeller son, he actually cares. He really wants to do things. He's trying to do things to help. He's got a plan for how they move forward, and everyone forgave the occurrence of the Ludlow massacre, and the business kept on going pretty much as it was. This is the origins of public relations. Ivy Ledbetter Lee recognized that if you want to maintain a gigantic business, which is occasionally going to do things that are super screwed up, you need to manage the public's impression of you. That's what PR is for. PR exists for the primary purpose of generating goodwill. And we see it all the time. Pharaoh's face is on the Sphinx because he wanted the people in his country to be scared of him, to believe that he had power. When there were visitors, he wanted them to be able to look at that and say, here is a guy who is mighty and I don't want to challenge. Caesar wrote about how awesome he was on his campaign so that people would look at him and say, wow, what a cool guy, I wanted to follow him, he makes a great emperor. There are names carved in stone at the Colosseum, which I think we've talked about before. All of that's PR. Now, when you engage in PR, what you're trying to do is manipulate public opinion. What that means is you're trying to get the average opinion, the average set of feelings about yourself or your government or your company or whatever to go up so that most people like you a bit more. Now, obviously, this is tied to advertising, and oftentimes it is with the purpose of selling a product that people engage in public relations. But it's distinct from that because you're never actually pitching something to sell, nothing specific. What you're trying to do is make people feel a certain way about your company. And as long as you can make people feel good about your company, then you can avoid hassles like government interference, you can avoid scandals, and consequently you can sell more things if you're a company. Or if you're a government, you can administrate more easily. There are two major PR models. Now, this is a gross oversimplification. Let me be clear, okay? There are a bajillion PR models out there. However, I would suggest humbly that all of these PR models can trace themselves to one of these two sources. First, we've got Ivy Ledbetter Lee, and we've already talked about him. His idea was, once we were in the age of mass media, he said, as soon as something goes wrong, as soon as things go bad, the media is going to get their hands on it, and they're going to tell people, because that's what they do, and that's what they're supposed to do, which means everyone's going to find out what a horrible thing it is that you've done. So rather than try to cover it up, and cover-ups, believe me, had been the norm for thousands of years for people in public offices or in positions of power. He said, you can't cover it up anymore. Covering it up doesn't work very well. So instead, what you should do is be upfront about it. Admit to it, tell them what's happening, and make it look like you're taking steps to address the thing. And if you can accomplish that, then people will like you for that. And he was more, he ended up being employed a lot by the most enormous businesses. I talked about the Rockefellers. The Vanderbilts were another one. There's a famous boardroom episode where Ivy Lee is in the boardroom with the Vanderbilts, and the seniorest Vanderbilt, he also was a lizard man like Rockefeller. And Ivy Lee is telling him about the importance of rehabilitating his image with the public. And Vanderbilt is getting angrier and angrier because he doesn't want to do anything to make people like him until finally he slams his hands down on a table and he says, "The public be damned!" Right? Like, he's just this gross, crazy lizard man. Anyway, we digress. Ivy always won them over. He's a good PR guy. Anyway, that's Ivy Ledbetter Lee. The other one comes from this power couple named Edward Bernays and Doris Fleischman. Their idea was to identify what the public likes and tout that, and downplay the negatives. In other words, you're going to find they would approach a situation and say, here are all the things that this organization or government or group or person is and does that people are going to feel really good about. And we're going to tout those things. And then anytime somebody brings up something negative about those people, we're just going to poo-poo it and kind of push it off to the side. They worked much more with the government than with companies, but they still worked very, very intimately with some companies. And I'll talk about that in just a second. For fun right now, I'd like you to go ahead and pause this video and take a look at the Wikipedia entries for Edward Bernays and Doris Fleischman. Don't spend a bunch of time. You don't have to read the whole thing, okay? Spend 3 minutes skimming each one of them, okay? Pause the thing. You read those and come right back. All right, you back? Okay, so with what you just read, what would you think about, let's start with Doris. What would you think about Doris Fleischman? Her Wikipedia entry, it talks about her philanthropy. It talks about how she was a feminist icon. She was one of the first women in the United States to keep her last name after getting married, and she did a huge amount of work to win women equality, and it talks all about those incredible efforts of hers. I would suggest to you, when you read Doris's write-up, she's a hero in that thing. Okay, what about Edward Bernays? Edward Bernays, it talks about as being one of the fathers of PR, but it talks about him in about the smarmiest way possible. He's a master propagandist. He was attached to all these very unseemly activities, and as it points out, he worked really closely with selling cigarettes, right? He was closely aligned with the cigarette companies, keeping their image solid and making sure that more and more cigarettes would get sold. Now, here's where we're bringing this around. I'm not outsourcing my work to Wikipedia here. Here's my point with this. Everything that Edward Bernays did in his whole life, he did in connection with Doris. They served on the same government committees. They worked with the same cigarette companies. Everything that they did, they always did together. And yet, her Wikipedia entry is glowing and heroic, and his is smarmy and disgusting. She looks like a hero on hers, and he looks like a total and complete villain. It is therefore my personal opinion that between Doris and Edward Bernays, Doris was the brains. That's Doris and Edward right there. I really think that she is the one who was the originator of all these thoughts. And even this picture is a PR picture, right? They're trying to show that she's a strong feminist who kept her last name, but here they are. They're still a loving couple. They're still lovely, but every time I look at this picture, I can't help but think that Doris looks downright predatory. Like, she's looking at him like, yeah, I could eat you. And absolutely, she kind of, I don't want to say she did, but in their philosophy of PR that you tout the positives and downplay the negatives, every negative about this couple got dumped on Edward, and every positive got shifted over to Doris. It's quite astonishing. I really think that she's one of my supervillain heroes. I really dig her in terms of her manipulation strategies. So, in my opinion, people give Edward Bernays a lot of the credit for early PR. I honestly think the credit really belongs to Doris Fleischman. She was the brains in that power couple. Anyway, they did some interesting things. You might recognize this one here. It was a very powerful and popular propaganda effort for the United States. This one also you probably recognize. This is the famous image of Rosie the Riveter. What we don't normally know or talk about is this is something that's now become very strongly associated with like the feminist movement, or even just not even that hardcore, like just with women's equality and with women's power and that sort of thing. Right? So this is a strong positive image in a lot of ways in modern day, but we ignore its context and origin. This was done as government propaganda, obviously, but beyond that, they designed this with the intention of selling cigarettes. They were on the payroll for Philip Morris at the time, and this was tied in with an effort to close this gap. At the time, only 27% of women were smoking. Over 80% of men were smoking. And so this was a big opportunity if they could pitch this sort of thing to women, then they could sell a lot more cigarettes. So it's a really interesting little piece of double duty that they got out of this image of Rosie the Riveter. You can see actually a lot of commonalities between that and this. This is another advertisement that they worked on. It's for Virginia Slims. You can see it talks about women as being biologically superior to men. It's a very tongue-in-cheek advertisement. It's funny when you read it, and it's intended to be funny. But you can also see what they're doing here, right? They are making a deliberate attempt to tie the smoking of cigarettes to this idea that women are empowered and self-actualized. They wanted to tie feminism to cigarettes because that would sell a lot of cigarettes. Public relations need to be engaged in by governments, corporations, churches, and individuals. Anybody who needs to have a public face of some sort needs to be able to engage in PR, right? Kim Kardashian has PR people assisting her for her own individual image, right? All the way along the line, you're going to see, and we're going to really focus on corporations, but it's everybody, governments too. Here, for example, is an advertisement, okay? Now, this is an advertisement that's ostensibly selling guns. However, it's a hard sell, right? Like, you can't have an advertisement that says, sell guns to your kids, or like, buy guns for your kids. It just wouldn't seem to work, right? Do your kids have enough weaponry? Make sure that they get some weapons, right? So, as much as this is an advertisement, I would suggest that it's even more a PR stunt here, right? It's saying, guns are part of this happy family, right? Do you have some lovely, nuclear boys that need to that are extra American? This is part of being a child in the United States and growing up in this fine country with its Second Amendment and so forth, right? It is a PR stunt in order to make guns a wholesome family product. And this is no commentary at all on guns themselves, right? But I think we can agree, like, this is attempting to put them in a particular context, which is odd, but works for this PR thing. What about this? We're kind of going to go the opposite direction here. Here we've got the famous Colin Kaepernick advertisement from Nike. It upset a lot of people. Colin Kaepernick made a name for himself because he was the quarterback for my 49ers. That's my team, is the Niners. And he would kneel for the national anthem to protest police brutality. A lot of people got very angry about this protest, and in fact, when he left the Niners, he could not get a job quarterbacking elsewhere. While he was out of the NFL effectively, this advertisement ran from Nike, and a lot of people were very upset about it. They're like, oh, Nike is so liberal. So now this is clearly PR, not advertising. Because when we look at this, there's no Nike products being pushed here, right? There's no shoe in this picture. There's no visible shirt, really, right? You can see that he is clothed, but who knows if that's a Nike shirt or not, right? This is a transparent public relations effort. So, but then here's the question. So why do you suppose Nike would want to align itself with this kind of controversial figure who had ruffled so many feathers? And he was kind of a darling on the left a little bit. He was a kind of a villain on the right a little bit, depending on how you sat. So why would they pick this? I'm going to suggest to you that this, it's not a coincidence that this came on the heels of Nike once again being called out for producing a huge amount of their shoes and their t-shirts and so forth in sweatshops overseas. Okay, they had child labor problems. They had dramatically underpaid labor problems, and this was causing a real image crisis for Nike. They looked like a really soulless company that was exploiting people and children so that it could sell clothing at a ludicrous markup and really rake in a huge amount of profits. And at the other end of this controversy, all of a sudden, this PR campaign, which was called an ad, but not really, it's a PR campaign. On the other end of that comes this thing, right? This is a deliberate attempt by Nike to rehabilitate its image and say, no, 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 we're not vicious, cold-hearted capitalists. Look at what we stand for here, right? They're recontextualizing it, and indeed, this did work. The general impression of Nike as a socially responsible company went up, and accordingly, so did their sales. First off, you got a massive increase in the amount of attention that they were receiving on social media. But beyond that, you also ended up with a very brief dip in Nike's sales and then an absolute surge in their sales. The generally positive feelings that they were able to generate and the way in which they were able to push back against this controversy that they had been enduring caused, on the mean, their sales to increase. It was a really clever, kind of evil strategy. All right, that's public relations. I would like for you to, you know what? I usually at this point would have you guys watch a couple of videos about the BP oil spill. They're really fun. But we've got some other stuff to do this time, so let's go ahead and skip over that. I think you guys get the idea already. Let's watch something. We'll make it quick. Here we go. Let's go BP oil spill update. There we go. Yeah, perfect.
When BP made a commitment to the Gulf, we knew it would take time, but we were determined to see it through. Today, while our work continues, I want to update you on the progress. BP has set aside $20 billion to fund economic and environmental recovery. We're paying for all spill-related cleanup costs, and we've established a $500 million fund so independent scientists can study the Gulf's wildlife and environment for 10 years. Thousands of environmental samples from across the Gulf have been analyzed by independent labs under the direction of the U.S. Coast Guard. I'm glad to report all beaches and waters are open for everyone to enjoy. And the economy is showing progress, with many areas on the Gulf Coast having their best tourism seasons in years. I was born here. I'm still here, and so is BP. We're committed to the Gulf, for everyone who loves it and everyone who calls it home.
Oh man, I'm so glad we watched this video. Okay, let's talk about what we just saw real quick. Okay, this is public relations, and you can see the imprint of both Ivy Ledbetter Lee and Doris Fleischman on this thing in a big way. Right? So first off, I'm gonna quiet Iris down here a little bit. There we go. All right, so here we've got Ivy Ledbetter Lee writ large, right? They're going through and they're talking about all these things that they are doing a year out after this incredibly terrible disaster that they caused. I will just tell you, that thing stunk. It wrecked so many beaches. My favorite beach, Siesta Key, was all covered in tar balls. It was devastating to the economy. It was really bad, okay? It was also the largest man-made natural disaster in human history that they caused. So anyway, you've got a lot of Ivy Ledbetter Lee in here. They're focusing on the things that they're doing to improve the environment. You've got a lot of Doris Fleischman here too, I would say, because they're showing really positive imagery. They might be talking about things that were kind of negative, but it's all associated with positive imagery. Over here, they're saying, what was it? She said, many sectors of the economy are having their best year ever. Whenever a company says to you many, you should always be a little skeptical, okay? Because many is not a quantity, right? It could be Al's Crab Shack and, you know, the place up the street from there. And, you know, if they can get like 4, that probably counts as many. Let's see what
the economy is showing progress, with many areas on the Gulf Coast having their best tourism seasons in years.
Yeah, just you see what I'm saying. So that's Doris Fleischman coming through really writ large. I couldn't help but notice too. This is a commercial about an oil spill. They managed to work in a picture of a woman in a bikini. That's pretty impressive, and as we know, that's one of the more persuasive things that that you can do. Also, we can see some of the classic propaganda tactics being used here. Where is it that you recognize Iris Cross from? Where have you seen her before? That's right. You've never seen her before ever. She's nobody. She's not important. Iris Cross is not a person who matters anywhere, right? And so this is, if we're remembering back to our propaganda class, this is an obvious plain folks appeal, right? She's a Floridian. She lives here. She's staying here. And BP is just as Floridian as she is. It's even some of the weird stuff in here is kind of done to amplify her plain folks appeal. Check like this part, which we saw.
All beaches and waters are open for everyone to enjoy.
She's a terrible read. She's clearly not an actress, right? And I'm happy to report that all beaches are open for everyone to enjoy. It's a terrible read. It's bad dialogue, but it makes her seem more genuine. She's clearly not an actress. She's clearly not a suit who's talking to us about this. And then, of course, tying her identity to BP at the end.
I was born here. I'm still here, and so is BP.
All right, I gotta stop. But you get the idea, right? That's public relations entirely. They aren't selling gasoline here. They're trying to work out an image for themselves, and they're using Iris and various other propaganda techniques to sell that. All right, that's one down. That's public relations. Let's go to sexual content. Now, I will warn you guys, while we're talking about this, there are going to be some kind of lewd pictures. There will be some, I would suggest, rather inoffensive nudity. Now, if you find yourself deeply affected by that sort of thing, definitely feel free to skip over those portions of the lecture. But one of the problems, I think, with sexual content in media right now is that it's taboo for people to talk about. And because of that taboo, we aren't talking about it, and it causes genuine problems. We do not know enough about what this content does, and that's a serious issue. Because as you're going to see in just a little bit, it's of outsized import for us as human beings, not just as a culture or society, but just in terms of like how much of this gets consumed. We need to start asking ourselves some harder questions, which means we're going to have the hard conversation about this. Brace yourselves, because I know that a 40-year-old pastor and professor is not the person that you want to be talking sex with in a video, but we have got to cover this topic. It's too critical for us to not talk about. So let's talk about sex in media, and we'll start with the Renaissance. Now, most of the time when a person sees this image, they're probably not going to feel offended. Maybe the first time you saw it when you were 8, you felt offended. You're like, hee, I can see his willy, right? Like you were a goofy kid. Wait, what? But you've seen this now many times, and you recognize that the nudity is part of the sculpture. You look at this and you say, well, it's art, and that makes it inoffensive, even though objectively this is a full frontal nude male. But beyond that, one of the issues with American reticence to discuss sexual matters is that we end up overlooking kind of critical elements. So, for example, when we look at this piece, let's think about it. Let's think about it first from the biblical sense, right? This is obviously Michelangelo's David. This is David standing there right before he's about to fight against the giant Goliath. And he's standing there. We would almost say that his pose looks kind of cocky. He's certainly confident. The sling is draped over his shoulder. He's palming a rock or two. And he's staring down Goliath like he knows he's going to kill him. Even though he's naked in front of the giant. He knows he's going to kill him. He's got this perfect body, giant muscles rippling. He's corded. He's thin. He's got great hair. Everything is about him is awesome, which is why it's a little weird that he's not particularly well endowed, right? It seems a lot of people, will address this thing and say, why did they give David the perfect body, and then for that portion of him make it so tiny? And that's part of the narrative that's going on here, right? Because he might look really confident, but actually, if we take a look at his face in close up, you can see he actually doesn't, when you look really close, he actually doesn't look confident at all. He looks scared. His brow is a little knit. His eyes that from down below at a glance looked really piercing. Now you can see there's actually a lot of fear that's written into those eyes. He's looking at this thing, and everything about him is giving off this aura of confidence. I know that my God is going to give me victory. But inside, there's still that human terror, right? There's still this thing like, is he really going to pull me through? There's still the human fear, even in the midst of the confidence that he has as a believer. He wrote it, Michelangelo reflected that on his face, and I would suggest with David's genitals, right? He's in full retreat. When a guy gets really just scared, that can be something that happens, right? And so every guy who sees this and thinks about it in that context has a certain visceral response to it. We've been in those sort of situations before where we were scared and our body involuntarily was recoiling. So everything that he has control over is showing confidence. But you can still see betrayed inside of him is this fear and uncertainty. The things that he can't control are betraying that he's not 100% confident. And that goes strongly to this kind of duality of being a Christian. Absolute confidence and at the same time doubt, right? Just like it says in the Bible, Lord, I believe, help me in my unbelief. Beyond that, this is David in his museum here. One of the first things that you notice if you actually ever get, I recommend strongly that you go to Florence and see Michelangelo's David. It's an astonishing thing to see. But one of the most astonishing things is he's freaking gigantic. David has become Goliath in this context, and they had him out in front of the Republic building, staring down the Medici Palace. These were people who could easily come in, and they were basically the local nobility. And Florence was kind of trying to send this warning to them with this stare down from David, who was looking straight at their palace, saying, "Don't try to be our rulers. Don't try to swoop in and destroy our republic. You're Goliath and we're David. Only now we are the ones who have grown to a great size." But even there, again, there's still this nervousness. This idea that the Republic is hanging on there in a fine way. Maybe they're expressing that God might be on their side, while at the same time expressing some deep-seated insecurities about that. So this is a pretty deep read. This is a pretty good read on Michelangelo's David, right? It's a pretty decent qualitative interpretation that's held to by most scholars, right? It would not be possible, or at least it wouldn't be as full, if we weren't willing to address the sexual content that was in it. Not addressing the fact that, that sexual organs were part of this story that's being told by Michelangelo diminishes the value of the artwork. And so this sensibility that sometimes we have about discussing these issues doesn't always work in our favor. Let's think about then some things about sex. First off, 29% of teens say that they get most of their information about sex from TV. Now there's an even larger percentage of teens that say that they get their information about sex from the internet. The single best-selling magazine issue every single year without fail is always the Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue. I know that this is not a surprise to anybody, but swimsuits are not a sport. Right? Bikini wearing is not an Olympic event. It's not actually a sport. It's just a way to sell many magazines. Also, one of the odd things, Ted Bundy blamed his crimes on watching pornography. Now, obviously, you should not take Ted Bundy's word. He's a famous serial killer. You shouldn't take Ted Bundy's word for freaking anything, right? He's the worst source ever. But it did get people thinking, what is the role of pornography, violent pornography? What is the role in that and violence, or that and sex crimes, etc.? Now, the government has always been a little bit paranoid about pornography. They started a first study in around 1969 called the National Commission on Obscenity and Pornography. Now, if you are familiar with the era around 1969, this was the start of what's called the free love movement. The free love movement held sway over the general sensibilities of the United States until quite recently. Really, I would say the thing that unseated free love is the Me Too movement, which started demanding that there be respect for women, and started pointing out the fact that if you believe that you should be able to have sex whenever and with whoever that you want all the time, you're going to create a lot of victims, and which is exactly what Christians have been saying for a long time. So anyway, but this was this original commission kind of came up in the start of that free love movement. A lot of the professors who were involved in studying this stuff were also caught up in that movement. And so when they conducted their research, they reported no known harm in connection with obscenity and pornography. A very famous researcher named Zillman saw those results and was like, really? No, pornography doesn't do anything? That would be really weird. Nothing does nothing. And if it did do nothing, then why would anybody ever watch it? It must do something. So what does it do? So then there was actually a follow-up to this report on pornography, and it concluded that there was harm that came from it. Now, at first, people might look at this and say, well, were there mixed results here? It's not really. I would say the Meese Commission had pretty good science that went on. Here's the thing. These were studies conducted a very long time ago. And for both of them, it was disastrous. The National Commission on, or let's start with Zillman's Meese Commission report, right? So that Zillman was the very quantitative scientist who said there must be something that's going on with pornography. When he published his studies and found, yeah, there are negative side effects to watching pornography, he started getting death threats from the mafia, because obviously the mafia was making a good deal of money off of pornography. It was feeding into a number of businesses that the mafia profited off of, not just the creation of pornography, but also prostitution and that sort of thing. Zillman received personalized death threats from the mob about his results. Meanwhile, the National Commission on Obscenity and Pornography, they were getting death threats too when they found that there was no known harm. They were getting death threats from like hyper-moralistic groups, some very fundamentalist Christian groups would send them death threats because how dare they say that there was nothing wrong with, or nothing dangerous about watching pornography. So no matter what your answer was, if you said there was harm or there wasn't harm, no matter what, people were going to threaten your life. Well, scientists don't necessarily like having their lives threatened for their research. And so, I kid you not, good research on this almost completely stopped. To say nothing of the fact that it's almost impossible to ethically conduct this research, right? It's hard to have an experiment where you say, come on in, I'm going to have you watch 3 hours of pornography and we're going to see if it turns you into a sexual predator, right? That's not a great study to conduct. So these are almost the last good studies. There's a few other things, but you're going to notice in this lecture, a lot of these studies are very old. And the reason for that is it's hard to conduct good science on this topic. One of the main problems with this topic is it's so hard to define. There is a famous quote from a Supreme Court justice where he says, "I don't know how to define pornography, but I know it when I see it." And that's kind of about the best you can do in some instances. But like, which of these would you say is sexual content? Okay, which of these are sexually charged images? Like, I would say this one probably on the surface is the most innocuous. They're both fully clothed, right? But they're clearly involved in an intimate situation here. This one, is, she's got a kind of come hithery type look, but, it's just a woman in her underwear. There's not necessarily anything overtly sexual about that, except that it's very scarce. Here we've got a group of women. None of them are wearing pants or underwear. So that one, I would say, is definitely pretty sexualized. Here we've got a guy, he's wearing nothing at all, laying on his stomach. And here we've got a couple, both of them topless, his hand kind of going down her pants a little bit, making out. Okay, so which of these constitutes, like, sex in the media? Which of these would maybe be sexual content? Which of these might even be obscenity? There's a lot of variance in how we conceptualize it, and so it's really challenging to say which one of these cross the line. Do any of them cross the line? Which one of these are appropriate? Which one of these should be allowed to run in what places? There's also some inconsistencies. Most people will find this image here to be significantly more sexual than this image right here. There's a tendency in general to find naked men less sexual than naked women. And so even there, even with just bare definitions, there's inconsistency in how we perceive them. Let's start with trying to distinguish between sexual content and pornography. Sexual content shows or implies sexual acts or makes sexual references or innuendos. Pornography is the graphic and explicit depiction of sexual activity. Kids' shows will frequently have sexual content in the form of innuendo. My daughters watch Barbie, for example, and there's lots of innuendo for Barbie's parents. They apparently have a pretty raucous and passionate relationship with one another. My girls never pick up on those cues, but my wife and I will glance at each other in shock at some of the things they say. Some of the things they say are so shocking, I'm not willing to say them on a Loom video where they could be used against me in the future. But just take my word for it. Children's TV can be pretty innuendo laden. Pornography is much more graphic, obviously. So, do these meet the qualification of sexual content? Again, it's hard to say for sure. I think most people would probably say this constitutes sexual content. Most of the other ones are pretty tough. Now, when we're dealing with the way the government defines it is not as pornography, not as sexual content. The government tries to create laws around obscenity, something that's obscene. And there are 3 criteria in order to define it. An image has to meet all 3 of these criteria in order to be legally obscene. First off, the material has to apply to what's called a prurient interest in sex. Prurient means very hormone-laden interest. Interest in sex for sex's sake, a lustful type of interest, right? So the only reason to be interested in the material is sex for sex's sake. The material has to be patently offensive or beyond community standards. Now, again, depending on your community, that might be different. And the material lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. So Michelangelo's David. Does the material appeal to a prurient interest in sex? Probably no. Is the material patently offensive or beyond community standards? It's not patently offensive. It's definitely beyond community standards, right? You can't go walking out in Mankato naked and stand there, like that with something over your shoulder and expect to be okay, right? So it's way beyond community standards, but it does have serious artistic value. So is it obscenity? No, it fails on line 1. It fails on line 3. Sexual content in media. Most music videos, you can see, I told you, ancient studies here. Most music videos have sexual content. I'd suggest that this number still works for right now. There was a content analysis done in the ancient days of pornographic videos. I would also suggest that these findings probably still hold true. It found 4 major themes in pornography. Reciprocity. This is the idea that if you do something for someone, then maybe they owe you a sexual favor. Domination. This is the idea that you can force somebody into sex. Exploitation. This is the idea that you can kind of blackmail somebody into sex. And autoeroticism. This is obvious, people just with themselves, right? What's interesting is with these 4 major themes, none of these are the main ways in which human beings have sexual encounters with one another, right? The main way is in a committed relationship. The second, in a marriage, the second main way is committed relationship, right? So the 2 main themes don't actually even appear in the most common, themes for pornography, which got researchers thinking, maybe this is steering minds in a direction that's not actually normal or natural. When we look at television, we find that 56% of television includes some form of sexual content. The Kaiser Foundation did an excellent study that found that most television has sexual content, yes, but mostly they're just talking about it. They're not actually showing it. Only 27% showed explicit sexual behavior. And of that 27%, only 10% of it depicted or implied intercourse, right? So the actual numbers of showing things were pretty small. Also, when it was looking at sexual behavior, it found that about half of them were involved in relationships. Now, on the one hand, you could say that's encouraging. And actually, weirdly, when I talk to researchers, most researchers think that that's good news, that half of the people are involved in a relationship. I would say that's actually bad news, because most people who engage in some sort of, sexual relationship with one another are in a committed relationship. It's not just 50%. It should be the overwhelming dominant portrayal if it's meeting with the way that humanity is actually working. And the fact that it doesn't suggests something about what's being glamorized. Also, and this is heartening, teen sex is almost always associated with risk, right? So if you're a teenager and you watch a show, it's likely that when you watch those characters engaged in some sort of sexual behavior, not necessarily sex all the way, but just like sexual behavior, it's likely they're going to encounter problems because of it. This carries through for a long way. Think about horror movies, right? The way that who's going to be murdered in the horror movie is, who have been the insufferably flirtatious, adulterous characters. They're dead, right? The guy who is pressuring all the females, he is going to be chainsawed. The girl who's flirting with all the men, she is going to be cut in half. This is a horror movie rule. Anyway, sexual content in media, magazines, pornographic magazine sales have been plummeting in recent years. People don't buy them anymore. Playboy tried to change this up. They stopped featuring naked women in their magazines, and their sales went down even faster when they got rid of them, right? Nobody was reading Playboy for the articles. However, weirdly, sexual content in other magazines is on the rise, right? Cosmopolitan has sex in every issue. Time has sex in every issue. It's on the rise in every non-pornographic magazine. R-rated movies. When you look at an R-rated movie, this is a rather big one. On average, they contain 17.5 sexual acts. That's for a single movie. So if you watch a 2-hour R-rated film, you're likely to encounter 17 or 18 overt sexual acts. That's a lot over the course of that's a really prominent feature then for R-rated movies. And as we've discussed in previous classes, anytime a new medium comes out, the first thing that comes out for it is typically going to be pornography. And we're seeing that as new media comes around. So without us actually doing decent research on this stuff, some of these things could have pretty deleterious effects. Now, there's been some work on what the effects of exposure to hardcore pornography might do. And it's not great research, if I'm honest, right? It's not been well-conducted science. But some of the results that are indicated are, it may result in sexual arousal. Well, one would freaking anticipate that. No, if you're watching pornography, you're probably going to feel aroused, right? Changes in attitudes and values. Okay, that makes a little sense. And behavioral changes. Well, that also makes sense. If your attitudes and values change, then your behavior is going to change also. Remember what we talked about when we talked about persuasion. So, sexual arousal. First off, explicit sexual content usually leads to temporary physiological arousal. Duh. Explicit sex tends to be more arousing for males. What we're going to find as we look at sexual content, men and women have really different reactions to it. Also, we can find that heavy exposure habituates the effect. In other words, the more that you watch it, the more you're going to want to watch it, the more likely you are to watch it in the future, and the less offensive you're going to find it, and the more you're willing to consume. Gradually, remember, here's Zillman once again. He's that guy who's like, porn has to do something to people. He found that repeated exposure caused desensitization. What that means is the more that you watched porn, the more that you saw sex in the media, the less you noticed it. My guess is that whole 17.5 sexual acts per R-rated movie seemed high to you. It seems high to me, right? Like, I'm thinking about R-rated movies that I've seen, and I'm sure, I'm like, I can't think of 17 and a half sexual acts that occurred in that movie. The reason I can't think of those is because I've watched so many R-rated movies in my life that I've gradually become desensitized to it, and therefore my perception of its prevalence has gone down. Exposure to explicit sex has caused some issues. There's less satisfaction with real-life partners. Remember, the extent to which people are learning about sex by watching movies. I had my anniversary the other day with my wife, and we watched a rom-com. Always Be My Maybe. There we go. Good rom-com. I liked it. The music was really good. I'm not a big rom-com fan usually, but I like Always Be My Maybe. I like When Harry Met Sally. Those are good. Anyway, we digress. There's a scene in there where the two protagonists are gonna hook up, okay? And he's literally carrying her up the stairs, and there's like 3 flights of stairs, and she's got her legs wrapped around him, and he's like carrying her up the stairs, and his muscles are just rippling everywhere, and they're making out the whole way up. And I'm watching this, and I'm thinking to myself, even in my prime, I'm pretty sure that wouldn't have worked. Like, if I had to carry anybody, if I had to carry my child up 3 flights of stairs, I'd be winded. But a full-grown woman, like, carry her up the 3 flights of stairs, by the time I got to the top, I'd be like, like, I'd be in no shape for it. So if this is the standard that's getting set for what constitutes passion, obviously the expectations are really, really out there, right? To say nothing of the body image expectations for a significant other. Holy cow, the kind of things that they're engaged in border on physically impossible sometimes, right? Well, if that's what your expectation is for your relationship, you're gonna be less satisfied because these things are not necessarily doable, or at least not routinely doable, right? You probably are gonna have, episodes of passion with your wife. But if that's the standard for your normal interactions, holy cow, that's going to be misery. It also increases acceptance of premarital sex and extramarital sex because you see so many people doing it. And to continue condemning everybody based on their engaging in this, it's exhausting. And finally, less desire for marriage, monogamy, and children. Now that one might sound like a weird finding, right? Because if you're married, you're going to have more sex, right? Like, that is the thing. And children, why would it have an influence on children? Well, again, let's go back to those expectations that are being crafted when we view lots of sexual content, right? If you're watching a program and in 2 hours there's 17.5 sexual encounters and they're of high passion levels, right? Then you're going to start to think to yourself, well, this is an important, crucial, central part of a happy, normal life to this huge extent. And I apologize if this causes any disillusions, children aren't great for your sex life. And so if you think that, if you've got an expectation that there's a certain level and intensity of sex that you're supposed to be engaged in order to have a happy, normal life, you're not going to want kids because kids are going to get in the way of that. You're not going to want marriage because marriage isn't necessarily going to have that level of passion. You're not going to want monogamy because you see so many people doing it with so many other people. Anyway, that's changes in values and attitudes. When you look at changes in behaviors, there's actually a couple of constructive things that can happen, particularly when it comes to teen sex, right? They might, when teens watch it, they'll typically engage in a lot more caution. This might constitute some of the only awareness that they actually have. And so there can be some good effects. There are some destructive effects, though. There's disinhibition. You believe that everybody else is doing it, and therefore you feel more entitled to do it. And there is a relationship to rape. Now, I want to qualify that massively. There's a correlation between the two, right? Rapists watch a lot of pornography. Now, I think you would have a very hard time saying the porn made them into rapists. It stands to reason that a rapist would watch a lot of pornography. And you can't really conduct an ethical experiment on this one, right? You can't take a bunch of students and put them in a lab, show them pornography, and then go see if they become rapists. It'd be a terrible idea. So it's an extraordinarily difficult relationship to demonstrate and prove. There are some mixed effects on aggression. If we show people arousing erotica, right? So erotica that's sexually loaded, they're more likely to aggress. So, this would be like passionate stuff. And then the aggression thing is like if you have a Confederate cheat them in a game or something, then the person's more likely to become aggressive. Now, this pleasing, non-arousing erotica, that would be something like David, right? He's naked, so it's erotica, but it's non-arousing. And that calms aggressive tendencies. So the behavioral outcome was a function of what of the nature of the erotica. There's a mixture of sex and violence that you see a lot, and that potentially has some harmful effects. We're going to skip that. You see sexual violence a lot in media, just in general. And when we conduct these experiments, there is a gender effect here. Over time, men gradually found slasher movies to be less degrading to women, unless, in other words, it looked less domineering. More enjoyable. What that actually means is that there's a perception that women enjoy being hurt during this stuff. They viewed it as less offensive and ultimately actually saw it as less violent after becoming gradually habituated watching it. There have been some studies of sex offenders that have attempted to link the viewing of pornography or sexual content to sex offense, and they developed this 4-factor syndrome based off of it. I want to underscore this is not great science, and a real causal link has not been demonstrated. So let me just start by saying that. But then let's take a look at this 4-factor syndrome. Klein hypothesized that there were 4 major effects from watching pornography. The first one is addiction. Now, when we're talking about addiction here, we're talking about addiction in the softest possible sense. The strict sense of addiction is I become dependent on a chemical produced outside of my body, right? I drink way more coffee than I ought to. If I don't drink enough coffee, I can potentially get a headache. I'll probably be crabby. I'm at least somewhat addicted to caffeine. My body craves it. Speaking of which, right? This is an RC Cola, in case you're wondering. Here, evidence. There we go. All right. Caffeine is a chemical that my body does not produce naturally. I bring it in from outside, and now my body wants it. Alcohol can be that way. Heroin can be that way. Any chemical from outside that you bring in that your body then becomes dependent upon is an addiction. Well, then when we talk about things like video game addiction, that's not really a thing. Sometimes researchers will call it habituated addiction, right? Like where you've done something so many times that now it's a habit. Maybe your body becomes dependent upon a natural endorphin or adrenaline release that is associated with using that media, but it's not an addiction in the classical sense. Pornography would be the same way. It's more habituated use than an actual addiction. You can't shoot up pornography, right? It's viewed, and then any effects that it causes are strictly internal. Escalation. This idea is that you can start off watching, soft core pornography, and then that advances to hardcore, and then that advances to violence, and you get the idea. You have to watch more and more hardcore stuff in order to continue to get the same rise. Desensitization means that, obviously, like we've been talking about, it does less for you, it bothers you less, etc. And a tendency to imitate. You see, we don't have a huge basis for knowing what's normal sexually, right? It's not something that you tend to watch other people do in real life. And so, if you consume a lot of pornography, you're going to start to believe that the things that are in the, those sort of media, that those are something that people can or should do. And so you have a tendency to imitate. Once again, I have to reiterate, there's no convincing evidence to support this 4-factor syndrome. It's just a thought line, and it's very difficult to develop any sort of evidence along these lines. Here's your mini assignment for today. I'd like you to get onto the discussion forums, and I would like for you to tell me whether you think the image below is obscene according to the 3 criteria to define legal obscenity. This is an advertisement for a perfume that I found. So anyway, remember the 3 criteria. The material appeals to a prurient interest in sex. The material is patently offensive or beyond community standards. And the material lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. It has to meet all 3 of those criteria in order to be obscene. Let me know your thoughts on in the discussion. Easy points for you. And I will talk to you next week. Have a good one, everybody. Bye-bye.